Welcome to part 3 of the second tutorial. In this one we're going to show you just how to use Dapper to grab some basic information out of the database. So first of all, we're going to start our Docker image of SQL Server. You see it's pretty quick to double click on that container now and get it started. So every time we do that, it'll be a nice clean database for testing. We're going to go to our user object and flesh that out a bit from the schema that we put in the database. So we'll put our user ID and we'll change the name to username. And then we will add a new folder and we'll call this data. And we'll put our repository classes in there. And the first one we'll make is the user repository. So over in the user repository, the first thing we're going to do is put a connection string. Now we're just going to make a static connection string for now, and we'll configure that out in a minute. But first we just want to get things up and running, make sure that we can connect to the database from our code and populate our objects. And we will also have a static string that will contain our query. So this will be the object query. This will be our basic user object query. And then for our connection string, we're going to use the C#6 string interpolation. So that just means you put $, at the front and we can put our actual values we want inside curly braces. Connecting to localhost and the database is CodePersuit. User is SA. Obviously, once again, we would not use this in production. And then the password, we're just going to get from an environment variable. So we're going to use the same name for the environment variable that we've used for our Docker container. This will simplify things later on, as you'll see. And once again, this is, you may inject your password from an environment variable. You may use something secure to inject that into your containers, but don't just use a clear text environment variable normally. So for our object query, we're actually going to use the name of command so that we map directly the properties of our object to the columns of the database. This is because it's a fresh database. We're controlling the database and it's really just a store of our objects. We're going to keep our objects really simple, not too many joins or any craziness there. That's how to get the best performance out of your database, unless you need something really complex. And we have to put brackets around user once again because it's a keyword. So we are going to use async methods for this because it's an IO call, and this will take some time, whether it's across a network or locally or whatever. For all IO calls, we should aim for them to all be async. There should be really no reason to make blocking IO calls. CPU bound calls fine, but IO calls should never be anything but async. So we'll just make a get all users method, and that will simply call Dapper. So we're going to have to add the Dapper package in. This one's by Mark Gravel, one of the many packages with millions of downloads. Nick Crover's in there as well, and Sam Saffron. So Dapper's a super thin, really high performance ORM, if you want to call it an ORM. It's pretty loosely an ORM. Unless you need really strong object mapping into a database or all kinds of other crazy features, you can stick with something like Dapper and really get some performance out of it, and simplicity of the API. So you can see for the API, all we do is create a SQL connection. Once again, we're going to open it async and we'll await on that. And then we're going to query first or default async, because this is the get users by name. Now, we don't have a query for the get users by name, so we're going to make one as a static string once again. This means we're not creating strings every time we hit these methods. And it will just be the object query, but then we'll put a where on the end. And we'll use string interpolation again. And once again, we're going to use the name of command, just so that if we change our object, and hopefully we're changing our database alongside that, then we will get a semblance of type safety here, and build time errors, hopefully, or build time changing at least. So now that that's done, we will come down here and we'll add that into the query. And then we will pass in the username as the parameter, because as you can see there, we've got an @username. Then we'll set up our get all users in a very similar sort of manner. Once again, SQL connection using the async version of open, and we will just return a straight query. So you can see Dapper is really simple to get up and running. I tend to keep my database access and writing, etc. simple from my microservices. If you need to do a lot of reporting, things like that, it's probably best done from SQL Server, or if you want to do searching, for instance, from an actual searching engine. One major advantage to keeping your database really simple and the access and queries really simple. One is performance, but the other one means you can switch to almost any database type. Just about every type that supports SQL will support basic select statements. So over here, we're going to add our repository as a singleton. And that means that there'll be one version of that everyone will grab down from their controllers. Next up, we will go to the user controller and we will add a constructor onto that, and we'll pass in the user repository. This will get automatically populated by ASP.NET's IOC, and so we'll just set a private member variable to that. So that's that done. Now what we'll do is we'll go down to our get method and we'll make that async now as well. As with all things async, once you start doing async, you need to pass it all the way back up or down until you get to your endpoint, ideally. And we will grab the user object directly from the repo by calling the get by name, passing in our username, and then we will test. We'll have to await that, of course, and then we will test to see if it's null. If it's null, we're going to return a not found result. And if we found the user, we will return an OK with the user object in it. For the get, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to return a task, and we will just return the call directory. We don't need to make this async, and we don't need to generate another state machine behind the scenes for this call. So we'll head over to our browser and let's just take a look. We should be able to go to /user, and we can't. Now the reason for this is if we step through it, we are not able to connect. That's because we said we're going to get the SA password from an environment variable, but we didn't set it. So over in our debug menu on our properties for our project, we will set the value in here. And up and running again now, and if we test the page and hit our breakpoint, let's go back to our window, and there we go. We've got our user. So that's the first one done. For the second one, we will add a repo controller. We will call it a repo repository. It's a bit repo, isn't it? Never mind. And over here, we're going to grab some of our previous code. Now, what I've realized is we're going to need the connection string in a couple of places. So we're going to make a Dapper config object, and we're going to have the configuration string as the only property on that for now. We may have other stuff later. And we'll cut that out of the original one. And now we'll go over to our config services, and we'll go services.configure, and then the Dapper config, and then we can configure that config directly in here. By wrapping it in a configure means we could actually make it dynamic, or as you will see later on, we'll actually get that to configure up out of a configuration store. So now we need to add a constructor on here that gets passed in an iOptions with the Dapper configure inside it, and then we will make a read-only iOptions Dapper config, and finally config. So there we go. And if it's null, we'll throw a argument null exception, because clearly we need a connection string, otherwise it's pointless starting up a database-based repository. So do .value and then .configuration string. Replace the same one on the other method. And then we'll copy and paste that into our repo repository, just replacing the name for the constructor, obviously. And we will set up here a couple of methods. One will be to get all the repos for a user, and that will just take a username and return a list of repos. Now, right now, we're returning the same object for lists as we are for a single item, but as we start to flesh out these objects later on, what we'll actually do is we'll make a summary object, and that will be returned in lists, and we'll make a full object that will be returned when you're asking for a single item. Obviously, if you're asking for a list to display on the screen or whatever, you won't need all the details of the repo. You just need some nice summary stuff to throw up there, or to pass back so that you can then query for the full details. Once again, we're going to use a string that is the object query set as a static read only. I just realized that we called it repository ID now, and we need to flesh this out a bit as well and put an owner ID on it. The nice thing about Dapper is we can just write really nice simple SQL statements for our nice simple database, and we'll use the name of trick again. And it really means that it's just a super lightweight way of doing things. We don't need a lot of configuration. We don't need a lot of mapping files and database contexts and all sorts of stuff. We can just do this really simply. Further down the track, we're probably going to add a cache between us and the database, so we'll see how that's done. By using this repository model, that means we can slip in a different type of repository, and during the cleanup we'll have a look at how we're going to improve that. But right now I like to do my initial development against concrete classes until you know the shape of the API, you know how things are going to work out. So we're just going to add our inner join, and once again we're going to map to the name of username to we'll make it like at name of, and then username with the at the front to say it's a parameter. So we might just skip over making this get all repos for user and jump to the next bit, which is more interesting. So the next bit that's more interesting is we're going to have two parameters in our query, and so it's going to be to get a single repo, and you'll have to pass in the user and the name of the repo, obviously because two different users could have a same named repo underneath them. So we'll add our object query, which will be the same as the previous query, but we are going to have a second parameter. The way we're going to pass in the two parameters is we're going to use an anonymous type. Just fix up those there. Once again, same deal, SQL connection, using the config value, and then open async. And then finally we do return await, and then query async, query first or default, returning the type of repo, and query, and then our anonymous type. So the anonymous type is going to have two properties, and they will match the name of the two attributes that we used in our query. I've forgotten to put async on there. So now I've put async on there. Once again, same pattern, call the repo, pass in our two parameters, and make it an async method. And of course we're going to have to say what type it returns now that it's returning an action. And for 200 it's going to return a repo. And if it's null, we'll return a not found. Otherwise we'll return the repo. I've made a couple of mistakes here. I need to make this method async for a starter. We have to await there, and I've got an extra bracket, and we need to put an OK around that. So this should work now. We start up and we go to our URL, and /repo/Lito, and we can see we've got the repo back. And if we go to Bob, we get a 404 not found. Back to Lito just to prove that it's working, and it is 200. Excellent. So that's pretty much all there is to using Dapper to read really simple data. That'll build a foundation. On our next part of this tutorial, we're just going to do a quick cleanup of our project code. Once we've done that, we're going to move on to some more meaty stuff in tutorial number 3. Thanks for watching.